There's a moment most people never understand. They decide they want to change. They imagine a different version of themselves. They even feel motivated for a short time. And then something invisible happens. The energy fades. The drive weakens. The new identity they imagined suddenly feels distant, unrealistic, or strangely uncomfortable. What they rarely realize is that this is not failure. It is not laziness. It is not lack of discipline. It is a psychological defense system activating. The mind is designed to protect what it already knows, not what it could become. So when a person imagines becoming someone different, more confident, more productive, more expressive, the brain does not interpret that as growth. It interprets it as uncertainty. And uncertainty to the human nervous system feels almost identical to danger. That is why change can feel wrong even when it is right. And that is why understanding this mechanism matters more than motivation ever will. Your brain has one primary job above all others. It is not happiness. It is not success. It is not achievement. It is survival. Every system in the mind is organized around reducing uncertainty and preserving stability. From the brain's perspective, the safest identity is the one you already have, even if that identity is limiting, frustrating, or outdated. Familiar patterns are predictable, and predictable means safe. When you attempt to change your identity, not just your actions, but who you believe you are, the brain treats that as a disruption to stability. It does not evaluate whether the new identity is better. It evaluates whether it is known. And if something is unknown, the mind automatically assigns risk to it. This process happens silently and instantly, long before conscious thought can intervene. That is why people can genuinely want change while simultaneously feeling resistance toward it. The resistance is not a contradiction. It is a protective response built into the structure of the mind itself. Most people assume identity is psychological. In reality, identity is neurological. Your sense of who you are is stored as patterns of prediction inside the brain. These patterns tell your mind what to expect from you and what others should expect from you. Over time, these predictions become extremely efficient. They reduce effort. They reduce uncertainty. They make life feel stable. But the side effect is powerful. Once an identity prediction is established, the brain begins protecting it as if it were part of your survival system. When you try to act outside your usual identity, speaking differently, behaving differently, thinking differently, your nervous system detects a mismatch between prediction and action. That mismatch creates tension. That tension feels uncomfortable, and discomfort signals the brain that something may be wrong. So the mind pushes you back toward familiar behavior, not because it wants to hold you back, but because it wants to restore internal stability as quickly as possible. One of the most confusing experiences during change is the feeling of being fake. Someone tries to behave in a new way and instantly feels like an imposter. They assume this means the change is unnatural or not truly them. But psychologically, that sensation has a very specific cause. The brain is comparing your new behavior to your stored identity model, and the two do not match yet. Because they do not match, the mind labels the new behavior as artificial. That label creates emotional discomfort, which many people interpret as proof that they should stop. In reality, the feeling of being fake is not evidence that change is wrong. It is evidence that change is new. The brain has not updated its internal model yet. Identity always lags behind behavior at first. The mind must see repetition before it accepts something as real. Until then, unfamiliar actions will always feel slightly unreal, no matter how intentional or meaningful they actually are. The brain is constantly predicting what will happen next. It predicts how you will respond in conversations, how confident you will feel in new situations, and even how much effort you are likely to apply. These predictions are not random. They are built from your past behavior. Over time, the brain becomes extremely efficient at forecasting the kind of person you are. When you attempt to behave in a way that contradicts that forecast, The prediction system flags it as an error. Errors require energy to process. They introduce uncertainty, so the brain subtly nudges you back toward the predicted version of yourself. This is why someone who is always identified as shy feels intense internal friction when speaking boldly. The mind is not judging the behavior morally. It is simply detecting deviation from its established model, and whenever deviation increases, the nervous system increases tension until stability is restored. There is a powerful illusion attached to comfort. Most people assume that if something feels comfortable, it must be correct, and if something feels uncomfortable, it must be wrong. But psychologically, comfort is simply familiarity. The brain rewards predictability because predictability lowers perceived threat. That means even negative habits can feel comforting if they are familiar enough. When you attempt to step into a new identity, the discomfort you feel is not a moral signal. It is a familiarity signal. The brain is saying this is not what we usually do. The problem is that most people interpret this sensation as proof they should retreat. They return to their old identity because it feels smoother, easier, more natural. Over time, that pattern reinforces itself. Comfort strengthens familiarity. Familiarity strengthens identity, and identity strengthens resistance to change. The cycle continues not because change is impossible, but because familiarity feels deceptively safe. Identity is not formed in isolation. It is shaped and reinforced through social feedback. Other people learn who you are, and they respond to you based on that version. When you begin to change, their reactions may shift subtly. They may question you, tease you, or express surprise. Even neutral reactions can feel destabilizing because they disrupt established social patterns. The brain is highly sensitive to social uncertainty. Historically, social rejection carried survival risks. So when your identity changes, your nervous system monitors how others respond. If reactions feel unpredictable, internal resistance increases. This does not mean others are consciously opposing your growth. Often they are simply adjusting. But to the brain, adjustment equals uncertainty, and uncertainty activates protective instincts. This is why changing identity can feel socially risky even when no real threat exists. The mind equates social stability with safety, and safety with survival. Changing identity requires more energy than repeating old behavior. Old patterns are automated. They run with minimal conscious effort. New patterns require deliberate attention. They require self-monitoring. They require correction. From a biological perspective, the brain prefers efficiency. It conserves energy whenever possible. When you attempt to adopt a new identity, the brain calculates the cost: increased effort, increased uncertainty, increased error correction. All of these demand cognitive resources. If stress levels are already high, resistance becomes even stronger because the system prioritizes energy preservation. This is why identity change often feels exhausting at first. It is not only emotional tension, it is neurological workload. Over time, repetition reduces the cost. What once required effort becomes automatic. But during the transition phase, the brain will always attempt to pull you back toward efficiency, because efficiency feels safer and requires less energy. The brain has a strong preference for internal consistency. It wants your thoughts, actions, and self-image to align. When they do, the system runs smoothly. When they do not, tension appears. Psychologists often describe this as cognitive dissonance, but in simple terms it is the discomfort of contradiction. If you see yourself as someone who avoids challenges, then taking initiative creates a mismatch between identity and behavior. The mind immediately tries to resolve that mismatch. It can do this in two ways. Either it updates your identity, or it stops your behavior. Updating identity is slow and demanding. Stopping behavior is fast and efficient. So most of the time, the brain chooses the faster solution. It produces hesitation, doubt, or distraction until the action stops. Once behavior returns to normal, the tension disappears. Not because the action was wrong, but because consistency was restored. When people attempt change, they often describe the experience with a specific phrase. "This doesn't feel like me." That sentence sounds like insight, but psychologically, it is usually resistance. The feeling is real, yet the interpretation is misleading. What they are sensing is unfamiliarity, not inauthenticity. The brain is comparing present behavior with stored identity data. If the two do not match, it signals that something is off. The signal is meant to encourage caution, not retreat, but most people interpret it as proof they are acting incorrectly. They assume authenticity must feel natural from the beginning. In reality, authenticity often feels unnatural during transition phases because identity has not caught up yet. The brain is not saying you are wrong. It is saying you are new. That distinction is subtle but crucial. Without understanding it, people abandon change prematurely, believing discomfort is evidence of misalignment rather than evidence of growth. Memory does not function as a perfect record of the past. It functions as a tool that supports your current identity. The brain tends to recall experiences that reinforce the version of you it already believes in. If your identity includes the belief that you struggle with consistency, your mind will quickly retrieve memories of times you stopped early or failed to follow through. These memories feel like objective evidence, but they are selectively highlighted. At the same time, moments that contradict that belief may fade into the background. This is not deliberate self-sabotage, it is efficiency. The brain stores patterns that help it predict future behavior. When you try to change, those stored memories activate automatically, reminding you of your previous pattern. The intention is not to discourage you, the intention is to maintain predictive accuracy. The system is simply trying to remain correct about who you are. One of the most misunderstood psychological forces is the pull toward familiar struggle. People assume they want relief from difficulty, yet often they unconsciously prefer a struggle they recognize over an unfamiliar ease. The reason is predictability. Familiar struggles have known rules, known feelings, and known outcomes. The brain understands them. Unfamiliar states, even positive ones, contain unknowns. Unknowns require adaptation. Adaptation requires energy and attention. So the mind sometimes chooses the known discomfort over the unknown possibility. This is why people can remain in patterns they consciously dislike. The struggle is unpleasant, but it is predictable. And predictability signals safety to the nervous system. When you attempt change, you are not only moving towards something new, you are leaving something known. That departure alone can trigger resistance, even if the new direction is objectively better. Identity does not update in real time. There is always a delay between behavior and belief. When you repeat a new action, the brain does not immediately accept it as part of who you are. It waits, it observes, it gathers evidence. Only after sufficient repetition does it begin adjusting its internal model. During that waiting period, you may feel as if nothing is changing, even though behavior has shifted. This delay is often misinterpreted as failure. In reality, it is verification. The brain is cautious about rewriting identity because identity anchors prediction. If it updates too quickly, predictions become unstable, so it requires consistency before making adjustments. This is why sustained repetition matters more than intensity. A single bold action does not redefine identity. Repeated aligned actions gradually reduce resistance. Once the internal model updates, the behavior that once felt forced begins to feel natural. Even when behavior changes, emotional reactions often lag behind. You might act confidently yet still feel anxious. You might take initiative yet still feel uncertain. These emotional echoes are remnants of the previous identity pattern. The nervous system has been trained through repetition to respond in a specific way. that response does not disappear instantly. It fades gradually as new experiences accumulate. If someone expects emotion to match action immediately, they may assume something is wrong when anxiety remains. But emotional lag is normal. The brain recalibrates in layers. Behavior shifts first, emotional response follows later, identity updates last. Understanding this sequence prevents confusion. It explains why growth can feel contradictory. You can move forward externally, while internally still feeling traces of the old pattern. Those traces are not proof of regression. They are evidence that the update process is still unfolding. Much of identity is reflected back to us through other people. Over years, subtle feedback from family, peers, and colleagues reinforces certain roles. The responsible one, the quiet one, the emotional one, the cautious one. These roles become part of the internal script. When you begin to change, the social mirror may lag behind your transformation. Others may continue interacting with you according to your old identity. That interaction can feel disorienting. It can even pull you back into previous patterns temporarily. The brain notices this mismatch between internal effort and external reflection. Because social coherence supports stability, resistance can strengthen when feedback feels inconsistent. This is not a deliberate pushback from others. It is a transitional phase. As your behavior stabilizes, the social mirror gradually adjusts. But during the shift, identity can feel unstable because reflection and intention are briefly out of sync. Rapid identity shifts are rare because the brain favors gradual adaptation. Sudden, dramatic change introduces too many prediction errors at once. The nervous system interprets this surge of unpredictability as stress. Stress narrows focus and increases the desire for familiar patterns. This is why intense bursts of motivation often fade. The speed of change exceeded the brain's tolerance for uncertainty. Sustainable identity shifts occur incrementally. Small, consistent adjustments create manageable prediction errors. The brain can integrate them without triggering strong defensive responses. Over time, these minor adjustments accumulate into noticeable transformation. From the outside, the change may appear significant. From the inside, it felt like a series of small recalibrations. The brain resists sharp disruption, but adapts well to steady repetition. Understanding this explains why stability supports growth more effectively than dramatic reinvention. The brain assigns preference to what it recognizes. Familiar patterns require less processing energy because the nervous system has already mapped them. When something is familiar, prediction becomes easier, and when prediction is easier, the body feels safer. This creates a bias toward repetition. Even if a pattern is unhelpful, familiarity alone can make it feel more comfortable than something new. The brain does not measure value first, it measures certainty. Certainty reduces cognitive load, and reduced load conserves energy. That conservation is interpreted as relief. Because of this, unfamiliar actions can feel heavier even when they are beneficial. The weight is not coming from the action itself, but from the processing required to evaluate it. Once repetition makes the unfamiliar predictable, the perceived effort drops. What once felt difficult begins to feel neutral, and eventually it can feel automatic. Familiarity quietly reshapes preference over time. At its core, the brain is a prediction system. It continuously forecasts what will happen next based on past experience. Accurate predictions create stability. Inaccurate predictions create adjustment. When you behave differently from your past patterns, your own brain becomes temporarily uncertain about what to expect from you. That uncertainty increases monitoring. Increased monitoring raises perceived effort. It can feel as if you are being watched from the inside. This sensation is not judgment. It is recalibration. The system is collecting new data so it can improve its forecasts. Until enough new data exists, the brain remains cautious. It prefers reliable predictions over exciting ones because reliability keeps the organism regulated. This is why repeated, consistent behavior is more powerful than occasional bursts. Consistency feeds the prediction system reliable information. Once the predictions become accurate again, the sense of internal friction decreases and behavior feels smoother. Stability is chemically rewarding. When the brain detects predictable patterns, it releases signals associated with safety and regulation. These signals reduce vigilance and lower internal tension. This is why routine often feels calming even when it is simple. Predictability allows the nervous system to relax. When a new behavior disrupts that predictability, the reward temporarily disappears. The absence of that stabilizing signal can feel like discomfort or unease. People sometimes misinterpret this sensation as a sign they are doing something wrong. In reality, it simply means the brain has not yet categorized the new behavior as safe. With repetition, the system relearns. The new pattern becomes predictable, and the reward returns. Eventually, the same behavior that once felt uncomfortable becomes the new baseline of stability. This shift happens quietly. It is not dramatic, but it is powerful, because once stability attaches to a pattern, the brain begins protecting it automatically. Effort is often misjudged. What feels difficult is not always objectively demanding. Much of perceived effort comes from uncertainty rather than exertion. When the brain cannot predict an outcome, it allocates more attention and energy to monitoring. That extra monitoring creates the sensation of strain. The task may not be physically or mentally harder, yet it feels heavier because the prediction system is working overtime. Once the outcome becomes predictable, the monitoring reduces. With less monitoring, the same action feels easier. This is why repetition can make something feel lighter, without changing the task itself. The change occurs inside the predictive system, not the activity. Understanding this distinction reframes difficulty. Instead of interpreting effort as a sign of limitation, it can be seen as a sign of unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity is temporary when repetition is present. Over time, if behavior remains consistent, the brain begins adjusting its internal model. It stops categorizing the action as unusual and starts labeling it as expected. This is the moment identity begins to rewrite itself. The shift is rarely dramatic. There is no sudden realization or announcement. Instead, there is a quiet reduction in resistance. The action that once required effort no longer triggers hesitation. The internal voice that questioned the change becomes softer. Eventually, the new behavior stops feeling like an experiment and starts feeling ordinary. That is how identity truly changes, not through intensity, but through repetition that the brain can verify. Once the internal model updates, the protective resistance weakens because stability has been restored. What was once unfamiliar becomes predictable, and once something becomes predictable, the nervous system allows it to remain without protest. When people understand this process, something shifts. Resistance stops being interpreted as failure. It becomes evidence that the system is protecting stability. The mind is not opposing growth out of sabotage. It is preserving predictability, because predictability has always meant safety. When identity begins to shift, the brain simply asks for proof before it agrees. That proof is repetition. That proof is consistency. That proof is time. Change feels difficult, not because it is impossible, but because the prediction system has not updated yet. Once it does, friction decreases naturally. Understanding this removes unnecessary judgment. It replaces frustration with clarity, and clarity allows patience. The mind resists what it does not recognize, but it eventually protects what it repeats. That is not advice, it is simply how the system works.